I am that always is right in the middle of my sentence, the recording. I'm Christina Bridges. I'm a research assistant professor in family medicine and community health.
Well, I don't know why my display always wants to put on the presenter view to you guys.
That looks good.
Yes. So this is our fourth and final installment of Turning the Page, Dying of Whiteness. Not the final installment of the Turning the Page series, but the final installment of the Dying of Whiteness book. Before we get started, just want to mention what the purpose of this book club is, remind everybody what the purpose of this book club is, that we are trying to understand the history that has brought us to this moment, including the patterns and systems of racism that continue to impact health, continue to impact policies, and as this book so clearly shows, continues to impact almost or all different aspects of our lives. We want to also use this space to practice talking about racism and racial inequities, to develop a common language and a common understanding about how it impacts our lives. We're also trying to use this space for personal learning and growth, to create a shift within individuals and to create a shift within our collective. Rethinking, all the different ways that these issues impact us all, right? And I think what the major thrust of this book is that racism isn't only negatively impacting people of color, it's negatively impacting all of us, impacting us at our wallets, impacting us in our health, impacting us in our well-being, impacting us in our sense of community. So, and we also want to promote or provoke an emotional state, right? A lot of this should make us uncomfortable because a lot of it's really awful when we think about it. But for some of us, this is really a new way of thinking about the world we live in and the community choices that we make, or the choices that we make as a community to bring that world into being. So, but we want to offer productive and constructive ways to deal with the negative emotions that learning this history and understanding it provokes, right? And then finally, committing to actions and systems change. Not just thinking about this on the individual level, like we start with the individual, but it's the individual level going out to systems level, having a systems level understanding and promoting systems level change. So with that, a little reminder about our author. Jonathan Metzl is a Kansas City native. Happen to know him. He is also a wonderful down-to-earth guy. He is trained as a sociologist and psychiatrist, currently the director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University, has done a lot of work in writing about structural competency, which a lot of med schools are now trying to play catch up with, and using the structural competency framework that he and co-collaborator Helena Hansen, who's out at UCLA, were some of the first to develop and write about. And for this particular text, he conducted his studies in 3 different states that had comparable populations, but just really trying to see how the discourse of whiteness really impacts health in all these different ways. And that was Kansas, Missouri, and Tennessee. We talked about Missouri first, then we talked about Tennessee. Today, we're talking about our home state of Kansas. The major thesis of the book is that the conservative culture war politics and policies that most appeal to working class white Americans end up making white lives harder, particularly working class white lives, and also making them sicker and shorter. Also, that the anti-solidarity and racist dog whistle policies aimed at punishing so-called minorities gaming the system, or the undeserving poor, right, are really at the heart of this. And this includes issues like blocking healthcare reform, blocking Medicaid expansion, tax cuts for the middle class and the wealthy, mainly for the wealthy, infrastructure divestment, massive infrastructure divestment. And the result of this is that psychologically and emotionally, these policies feel like they are wins for conservatives. But those policies end up being as dangerous for working class white people as asbestos or secondhand smoke exposure, or not wearing seatbelts in cars. So a little note further about what we mean by the undeserving poor. This is an excerpt from by now a famous essay by James Morone, Enemies of the People, The Moral Dimensions to Public Health, where he writes that every nation community thrashes out criteria by which to determine members, allocate rights, assert privileges, and identify strangers. We, them, and the boundaries in between are all cultural constructions. It is precisely at this point that liberalism, community, and moralism achieve their American symbiosis. Moral images set the boundaries around the liberal process, around the great imaginary community of the American us. And this is at the heart of Metzel's text, right? Said on the other side of the moral divide lurk the American others. Today, they are constructed as undeserving, even predatory, lazy people grasping for overly generous health and welfare benefits. They are undisciplined. They abuse the rights of a liberal society. The political imperative follows directly. These others must be converted or controlled. Efforts to do so infuse American politics with images of vice and virtue. The politics of drugs, drink, immigration, sexual preference, unwed mothers, and welfare reform are all redolent with moral condemnation. And we could add healthcare to that list as well. And as we have gone through in the preceding 3 sections where we discussed this book, all of these sentiments come directly into play. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bridges, who's going to talk about the Kansas experiment.
So many of you probably don't need this reminder because we're all in Kansas. Not sure how long all of you have been here or which side of the state you live on, or if you have children in school, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But just as a reminder, the Kansas experiment is describing these major tax cuts that were put into law in 2012 by then Governor Sam Brownback. And it was one of the largest income tax cuts in the state's history. It was actually based on model legislation published by a conservative group, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. And so what these cuts did, or tax cuts were 231 million in the first year. And then they were projected to total 934 million annually after 6 years. And basically it eliminated taxes on business income for owners of almost 200,000 businesses and cut individual income tax rates. But if you go to the next slide, I'm going to read a little bit what he describes about this picture. He says, it wasn't all, just tax cuts. Actually, some groups had increases in tax. So a nonprofit group called the Kansas Center for Economic Growth culled the data from multiple sources for the first 4 years of the 2012 tax cuts. And the group's report, Kansas Tax Plan Makes Racial Economic Disparities Worse, illustrated the extent to which the cuts exacerbated racial wealth disparities. The data showed that the 2012 tax cuts deceptively increased taxes on the bottom 40% of earners in Kansas, or those earning $42,000 a year or less, by hiking sales taxes and eliminating tax credits that benefited low-income families. And such trends disproportionately affected minority communities, including 75% of African American and 83% of Latino households in the state. And by contrast, according to the report, Kansans who saw the biggest tax cut were mostly white. So indeed, the rate of white Kansans in the top tier of earners is 2 to 3 times that of Black and Latinos in the highest earning tier. So this is kind of what's represented here. In the bottom two income groups, which is the far left, the average earner in these groups saw a tax increase. And you can see the three groups are showing you the demographics. So that's, the overrepresented in those groups were Black and Latino Kansans. And then moving to the higher income level on the right, of the wealthiest Kansans, whites benefited from the tax plan at 2 to 3 times the rate of Blacks and Latinos. So it exacerbated already disparate wealth. Did you want to talk about this one?
And this is another way of showing that, where we're looking at sort of the percent changes in taxes due by household income category. And you can see, right, the poorest had almost a 15% increase in their amount of taxes due. And everyone else, from, sort of second poorest to middle income, fourth, the next level, and then the top 1%, you see where most of the tax savings went. And they were concentrated for the very most wealthiest of Kansans under sort of this long-time rhetoric that we used to hear from Ronald Reagan, right? Sort of trickle down theory. We've been hearing it now for a few generations that if we just let rich people make all the money in the world, that they're going to be really generous and share that money with the rest of us. They're going to do more hiring, they're going to have more construction, they're going to create more jobs, and it keeps never happening. It always plays out like this over and over and over again. But voters continue to vote for it because of the rhetoric of the undeserving poor, right? And that's what we saw most clearly in these policies.
So after a few years, though, of these tax cuts, the state revenue had fallen by hundreds of millions. So then they had to cut back spending on roads, bridges, and education. And so, of course, in this book, he goes into kind of great detail and interviews lots of parents and teachers talking about the changes to education funding. And so with this economic growth, the jobs weren't increasing like they had said. Even the Republican legislature was like, this is it, this isn't working. And they voted to roll back the cuts. He tried to veto that, but they were able to succeed in overriding that veto. So that ended in 2017. But we know that, you can go to the next slide, that maybe many of you have had children in Kansas schools or live on the Kansas side and really experienced this firsthand. So we would like to hear from you all what your experience was during this time. Anyone want to share? We thought you would have a lot to say.
Well, I'm a Missouri resident, so I didn't specifically experience this period, but that graph perfectly illustrates the issue that I've always had with the tax system, which is like the more you have, the less you pay, which to me is backwards, because like the less you have, the less expendable, funds you have. So to me, it should sort of grade up instead of stepping as well. But it seems to me like the more resources you have, the more you should share the burden with those that don't have the resources.
I like that visual too. At the time I was living on the Missouri side, but working obviously in Kansas, and just hearing how this was going to negatively affect education and libraries. And yeah, I just remember hearing about it a lot at work.
I moved here to this area to start this job in 2018. And when deciding on whether or not I was going to live in Missouri or Kansas, the Brownback tax cuts were fresh in everyone's mind. And I think, still trying to recover. And it made it very clear, that she'd probably try to live on the Missouri side.
I grew up in Kansas. Sorry, Christina.
Oh, go ahead.
So I was in public schools back in the days when they were still funded well. I went to a big school in Wichita, and yeah, it seemed decently funded. So we had a lot of I don't know, those specials, like higher science and higher math, and that was available. Then I transferred in there from a small school that had small cities, small resources. So
I live on the Kansas side, but my kids didn't start school until my oldest in 2018. So it was kind of after all of this, but probably still feeling the effects for sure. But I am in a district that has a lot of financial support from parents. And so I know that they eliminated Spanish teachers from our entire district, but the parents pay for Spanish. And we've also paid for a counselor because it wasn't funded anymore. So we'll kind of talk about that later too. different neighborhoods and the differences in schools. Does anyone else want to say something? I saw a couple things in the chat.
I'll add to the conversation a little bit. I'm from rural Kansas, and I don't have children in school, but it was interesting for my parents who were considering their grandchildren at the time, became again very active in the public school system, going to the town hall meetings and hearing them talk about all the cuts that were happening. There has always been, I think, a very wide divide between Johnson County, Kansas school district and the rest of Kansas. And as you're saying, Christina, parents and local funding that isn't state funding, that the rest of the state sort of has to rely on state funding. When the state funding is cut, that cuts everything. And so, they were talking about building repairs and having to close schools because they couldn't afford the building repairs, and having to, it was cheaper to bus kids 30 miles to consolidate the schools than to keep two schools open. So it was very striking, the difference that was happening, I think, in the rural communities across Kansas than what was happening in Kansas City.
Yeah, Rebecca, I absolutely agree with that. As somebody who is a graduate of the Shawnee Mission School District, it always seemed like there were things going on in our area that weren't happening. There maybe would be cuts, but nothing that detrimental in the grand scope of things. But in more Western Kansas, more rural Kansas, where my mother's from, more Western Kansas, my dad's from more Southern, and just hearing the different experiences, and we'd go visit to see the disparities in the schools. We really are having different experiences. Although all of us got to experience No Child Left Behind. You ever want to talk to me about that? Tell you how fun that was.
Thank you all for sharing. All right. So in the book, he kind of goes through some of the data that they were able to pull from Kansas School Board, looking at, what happened basically during that time. This is a really good, I think, example. It's showing math scores for fourth graders. And you can see, along the bottom, this is the year starting 2009, and it goes all the way to 2015, and kind of right about that 2013 mark, you see this dip down. And this is showing by race. So you can see that, white students, the line for white students is kind of above, and then that average all together is the darkest line. And then we're seeing this, inequity in the lower test scores. And so, kids of color, Kansas kids of colors, scores were hurt worse, but everyone's scores, started to dip down kind of right after that. And then if you look at the graduation rate, this graph is showing, so the solid line is the actual graduation rate for the 2009 to 10 school year, all the way to the 2015 to 2016 school year. But the dashed line was if the trajectory had continued that was kind of starting there in the 2010 school year, but then you see it flattens out right about the time of these cuts. But had that trajectory continued, it could have looked, like that line. And so that gap in between, those are perhaps all the people that didn't graduate from high school because of these tax cuts. It's kind of the point of this. And what we know, if you want to go to the next slide, just from research about education and health, we know that education is, a social determinant of health. And these are just a couple of the points that they talk about in the book, but research has shown that US adults with a high school diploma have 9 years less of life compared to those with a college degree, and that the prevalence of diabetes is twice as high in US adults with a high school diploma compared to those with a college degree. And so, all those people now lost in that gap, we're talking about, life years lost, and perhaps decreased health. And even knowing this, we can talk about this and the facts out there, but the idea of the value of education has seemed to have different messaging based on which political party you're following. So this next slide, this is again from the book, and it's from the Pew Research Center, and it's looking at opinions of whether college and university has a positive effect on the way things are going in the country or a negative effect on the way things are going in the country. So on the left is Republicans that were surveyed, and the right is Democrats that were surveyed. And you can see that there's 2 lines. So there's a slightly darker line that's at the top in both cases. And that's those who said, it's positive, has a positive effect versus a negative effect. And you can see that for both parties, positive was always higher than negative, but right about that 2015 mark, it dipped down, and Republicans started answering more often that it has a negative effect on the way things were going in the country. And so this, the messaging kind of around the importance of education. So I think we thought this interview really illustrated the fact that people can have an experience that, these tax cuts were detrimental, that they didn't like it in their state, but continuing on, just following sort of party messaging, even if it includes more cuts like this, even at the federal level, that folks are willing to go along with it. It's almost like they have amnesia. So I'm just going to read this interview that he does. So it's from 2017 with a parent in Kansas City. So JMM, that's the author. So we were talking about Governor Brownback a moment ago. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on his appointment as ambassador for religious freedom in DC? So I don't know if all of you know that, but he was invited by President Trump to come and join the cabinet. Okay, so the parent, PA 48. Honestly, it's great that we're finally getting him out of Kansas. He's just been an absolute disaster on all levels. Raided money from the highways, raided money from old people and the pensions. Worst of all, he destroyed our public schools. They used to be so great. Now all we do is worry about them. Total disaster. It's a good thing he's gone. JMM. Yes, looks like he's landed on his feet in the Trump administration. PA 48. Maybe he'll do better there. I'm sure Trump will straighten him out. JMM. You're supportive. PA 48. I'm a huge Trump supporter. JMM. Many people are, but from the perspective of Kansas, it just seems interesting that many of the same policies that seem to have failed so miserably in Kansas now form the basis for what Trump's trying to do, like huge tax cuts for wealthy people and corporations, or defunding schools and proposing block grants. These were the very policies that got Brown back into trouble, no? PA 48. Who knows? Maybe you're right. You probably are, come to think of it. I just know that it's not just me. My husband and his brother and my nephew and all his friends are going to support Trump no matter what he does. It's not about his policies or anything. They just feel like, as white men in America, their voice wasn't being heard. Trump gave them their voice back.
All right. So we have allotted more time for an activity for us as a group, and for discussion for us as a group. And we're going to ask you to do some math and draw on some of those skills that you developed while you were in school. And this activity is aimed largely at sort of trying to calculate, what does the politics of whiteness cost us personally when it comes to our children's education? And for those of you who don't have children, but who are, still young enough to have gone through some of this themselves, like, you can calculate it for what it might have cost you or your parents. Or you can do this if you have close siblings or friends who are struggling with some of these same issues. So we're going to walk through, and while we do this, I want you to ask yourself, what K through 12 schools do my kids attend, right? And whether or not you pay for your children's education in housing costs or in tuition, all right? So some of us, right, have, as we do, we choose the neighborhoods we're going to live in based on which ones have the best schools. Those neighborhoods tend to have much, much, much higher home costs, right? So we pay for that. I mean, if you're a big baller shot caller and you can just write a check for the whole amount, that's great. But most of us pay for it in a mortgage, right? So thinking about how much extra you would have paid in a mortgage to be able to live in the school district that you think is going to give your kids the best chance. Or if you did not go that route, but are choosing, or considered private school education for your kids, how much was that tuition a year? So if you paid for your children's education and housing costs, how much extra did you pay for your home, both principal and interest, in order for your kids to attend a better school? If you're not paying for your child's education in your mortgage, then, which is very common, right, for academics and folks at our institution, is that they may be paying for your children's education and private school tuition, right? The average private school tuition in Kansas is almost $8,000 per year. The private elementary school average cost is about $7,000, and the private high school average is around $10,000. So, if there's any of us included in that, right, who felt that the public schools were just not sufficient, or if any of you ended up coming up in a system where your parents thought that, it was best for you, we want to calculate how much one could expect to pay in K through 12 private school tuition for all of your children. In essence, for going public education, right? And then here on the right, these are some of the most expensive here in the area. Horizon Academy coming in at $27,000 a year, almost $28,000. Mauer Hill Mount Academy in Atchison, $26,000. Bishop Seabury in Lawrence, $14,000. Hyman Brand Hebrew Academy in Leawood, $12,000. St. Thomas Aquinas in Lenexa, $11,000. St. James Academy in Lenexa, also $11,000 too. Bishop Mage, $10,004. And while we're thinking about some of that, just to contextualize some of this, right? This is another way to look at the divestment from public education. And we're looking at the rising cost of public education compared to tuition for everything else, right? And this is one of those areas where many of us have been feeling this pinch. For me, I went to college in the 1990s, in grad school in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? And even then, we were talking about just what an astronomical amount of money that it costs to go to college. And it's a popular refrain, right? Like, just that this was ridiculous. However, it's become exponentially more ridiculous in terms of thinking about this. And this is not, right, just a natural rate of inflation for higher education. Here's another graph that helps us sort of look at this. How much would college cost annually if prices kept pace with inflation over the last 50 years? And you can sort of see where we are 21, 22, right? The average cost or actual private college cost average was over $50,000. When you look at the actual public college cost, the average was around 23,000 per year. But then in the orange and the yellow, we can see what those costs would have been if there had not been the massive public divestment from education, what those costs would have been for us. And that's about, between a 50 and 60%, somewhere between 40 and 60% reduction in the overall cost. I remind us here a flashback to the text, The Sum of Us, that we read together last year, when Heather McGee actually talked about this shift in divestment in public education. And on pages 41 through 42, as she described, for generations, college-going white Americans could count on public money from their government to pay most, if not all, of their costs of higher education. That's no longer the case. The rising cost of college feels to most Americans like so many aspects of our economy, unexplained and unavoidable. But the causes of rising tuition are linked squarely to the withering government commitment to public funding. The federal government slowly shifted its financial aid from grants that didn't have to be repaid, such as Pell Grants, right, which used to cover 4/5 of college costs, to federal loans. Student loans enable Americans to pay for college, for sure, but the compounding interest means they must pay at least 33% more than the amount borrowed, and that millions of students are also paying double-digit interest on private loans. So when we are sort of thinking about all this together, using the average inflation rates for a 4-year college education. So if you have young children right now and you're thinking about the future in terms of what it's going to cost you because of this historic trend in divestment from public education, such that, or because we don't want the so-called undeserving poor to benefit from the largesse of a robust public education system. In 2040, if your child is going to a private university, you can expect to pay about $188,000 per year in tuition plus room and board. And at a public university, you can expect to pay about $85,000 per year for tuition plus room and board at a state school. So we want you to think about like how much this is going to cost your family. And add this to the extra you pay either in home costs or K through 12 tuition, right, to arrive at a total cost to your family, just the politics of whiteness around children's education. Be thinking about that. As we break up into groups, we have a nice large group of folks attending. And this is what we want you to try to calculate for themselves. You can guesstimate, it doesn't have to be down to the dollar. And talk about that in the groups. We'll give each group, it is 12:37, so we'll give each group about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about what you all talked about in small groups. Sound good? So if Alexa